Angelo Roncalli left Bergamo for Rome as a hopeful young seminarian in 1901, so for the last few years of his studies, and returned at the start of April 1905 as secretary to the newly appointed bishop. So Redini Tedeschi was, in fact, consecrated a bishop by St. Pius X, which seems surprising, but sometimes bishops turn out to be bad, despite the best efforts to supply good ones for the church. That can happen. But he was, in fact, personally consecrated by St. Pius X, according to my reading. And opinion in the diocese, already divided under the two previous bishops, was far from unanimous about the appointment of Redini Tedeschi. So Roncalli was to write the biography of Redini Tedeschi, whom he always called with pride and affection, my bishop. So clearly his mentor, as we've seen, having taken possession of his diocese, Redini Tedeschi, accompanied by his secretary, immediately departed on a national pilgrimage to Lourdes. A visit to France was a pilgrimage, but it also gave the opportunity to measure the impact of, the author says, Pius X's policy towards France. So in some of these instances, we might quote the work more or less directly. In other instances, actually drawing correct conclusions from what things that the author says, and therefore altering the exact words of the book to an extent. But that's where they saw really the aftermath of the ralliement, the attempt of Leo XIII to rally French Catholics to the Republic, which the author says was rejected or had been rejected, meaning by St. Pius X, as appeasement. He puts it in quotes because he doesn't agree that this should something that should be rejected. And of course, appeasement has a negative sense to it, that you are giving in to something, to somebody or to something aggressive in order to try to acquire peace. So appeasement as in giving in to the demands of Hitler at Munich in 1938 or something like that. That's usually what's associated with the term appeasement. So this author here dismisses, or seems to hold in personal doubt anyway, that this was actually just a case of appeasement, but it's clearly speaking negatively of St. Pius X, whom he clearly holds in low esteem, referring to him simply as Pius X, but further indicating his distaste for everything St. Pius X by saying that he had rejected the attempts of Leo XIII as appeasement. Right, so the new policy was one of confrontation, expressed with admirable clarity by Cardinal Merry Delval. If only one could persuade the French that their salvation lies in battle. Although what we'll see here is that what Cardinal Merry Delval says is, it's true, it's unfortunate, what had happened to in a sense, the resistance among French Catholics to the Third Republic. It was unfortunate, but it was really hardly surprising, given exactly the policies of truly what can be characterized as appeasement that had been pushed by Leo XIII for a long time, which clearly brought about little to nothing, as Leo XIII himself complained about in some of his encyclicals, saying, in essence, that we've been nice to you, but you haven't been nice to us back. Why is that? And the reason is that the Freemasons in the Third Republic really had no intention of ever being nice to the church. But they'd take any concessions the church might give, but they were never going to give any back. That's for sure. So the new policy was one of confrontation, which, well, we saw already. We're talking here about 1905. That's the same year, maybe 1905 or 1906 was the year of the publication of VII. 1905 was the year in which the French Republic unilaterally, remember, annulled the Concordat with the Holy See. And that made it clear that the ralliement had just completely failed. That Leo XIII's policy in that regard had yielded none of the desired results. And the only thing left to do was just fight for the right of the church to exist in France. That's the only way forward at this point. So it's really not surprising. Cardinal Marie Doval is right, and of course, to be dismayed about this, but it's really not all that surprising, all things considered. So he said they should oblige us to restrain them, to moderate their ardor. In other words, they should be rearing to go. They should be on fire here. But instead we have to push them. Yet they are on the battlefield and the front line. Men in that position are generally only too anxious to fight. But they just want to surrender. I am thinking particularly of the leaders, the intellectuals who are actively involved. So what he's saying here is, of course, correct. That really the correct response is to fight the Third Republic tooth and nail with whatever legitimate means you have. But that's not happening, but really because of the policies of Leo XIII. So, Pius X, the author leaves off the title Saint. Pius X favored papers like Ricosa, edited in Milan since 1890 by three priest brothers, Andrea, Gottardo, and Jacopo Scoton. It was the organ of the intransigence. The author puts that in quotes, as though dismissing the idea that their firmness was something good. Their proud motto was frangar non flectar. So if you recall your Latin conjugations, you know that means I shall break, but I shall be broken, really, but I shall not bend. So they would rather break than bend before the winds of change. In other words, our position is against anything and everything modernist, anything and everything that seeks to compromise. And we will break in the face of the forces of change, making a stand against them rather than give way. Whereas Don Roncalli repudiated this attitude and modified the motto to flectar non frangar. I will bend, but I will not break. So by way of mockery, in effect, he decided to modify that. He wrote to, this is Roncalli, writing to Loisy. Remember, Loisy, who was excommunicated and reduced to the lay state for refusing to abjure his errors when called out by St. Pius X. So Roncalli, in communication with Loisy, wrote, in Milan, you know that our friends will found a review, a sort of Italian demain, called Rinnovamento. So demain was a French publication, which means tomorrow, looking to the future is the idea, which was, we'll get an idea if you're not familiar with that one, which is not our focus here. Get an idea about what that must have been from what we'll see from Rinnovamento. And Roncalli also, in the same letter to Loisy, wrote, I met Fogazzaro too, in good physical and spiritual health, full of vigor and determined to win through. So, if you look at this next, Fogazzaro was the author of a novel, Il Santo, in which he had imagined a pope who would go out among the people, a book which was placed on the index of forbidden books in 1905. So, Il Santo was, in this novel, an interesting point, it may just be a coincidence, but the name of the Pope in this, who is held up as being, this is something excellent, as a saint, the Pope, of the name of this fictional Pope was Benedict. Now, it may just be a coincidence, but the name that Della Chiesa took just less than 10 years after the publication of that book was Benedict, and he was definitely not in favor of all of St. Pius X's methods of repressing modernism. Now, whether there's any connection there, it's hard to say. You really have to prove that, one way or the other, but it does make you wonder. Why did Della Chiesa choose that name so shortly after the condemnation of that book, or so relatively shortly thereafter, when the name of the Pope in that book was Benedict? There's nothing wrong in itself, of course, with the name Benedict. There's nothing suspicious about that in itself. But in connection with that, it is a cause to wonder to some extent. Especially considering that Della Chiesa was on the watch list, so to speak, of the Sodalitium Pianum. So the principal target of the Scotone brothers was Cardinal Andrea Carlo Ferrari, the Archbishop of Milan. So after the publication of Pascendi, the modernists declared that they could not find themselves in the incriminated system. So you may recall the name of the book that put out by Jansenius himself, for whom Jansenism is named, the Augustinus. We just had mention of that recently, reading a table. It seems that Jansenius himself was not pertinacious in the errors that he put forth, and that his book only came to prominence after his death. But the fact remains that it was erroneous, and that he claimed to base his teachings on the writings of St. Augustine, hence the name Augustinus. But when that book was condemned, the errors in it were condemned, the Jansenists said, that's not our system. Whatever the Holy See has condemned is bad, for sure. But that's not what we say. That's not our system. The Jansenism condemned by the Holy See is not the Jansenism of the Jansenists, in essence. We've mentioned this before. It always bears repeating, that that's false, because that is one of the that falls into the heading of dogmatic facts. Actually, that is to say, facts which are not dogmas of faith in themselves. They are not contained in divine revelation, but are so closely connected to dogmatic definitions of the Church that to deny them sets you on a collision course, so to speak, with something that does go against the faith. It sets you on a course to denying some dogma of the faith, some dogmatic definition. And in this case, the dogmatic fact that we're talking about with regard to the condemnation of Jansenism is that the Church actually not only is the custodian of divine revelation and can infallibly propose and explain divine revelation, but also recognizes the contrary errors where they in fact exist. So, to deny that the Church has correctly identified that there are errors in this book sets you on a collision course with denying what the Church actually teaches. So, those are true. So when the Church condemns an error, it is necessary not only to assent to the fact that to assent to the condemnation and hold the opposite of what is condemned, but also it's necessary to assent to the fact that the Church has recognized where those errors actually are. So the Church should say, these are errors and they are contained in this book. And that must assent to, under pain of denying a dogmatic fact, which is gravely sinful. So that's an example of dogmatic facts. You'll see more about that in De Ecclesia, in our ecclesiology course. And so the modernists are coming very, very close to doing the exact same thing here. If there's any distinction, I can't see what it is between what the Jansenists said and the modernists in this case. Their denial that is our system. Yeah, this is a condemnation. Perhaps it's not a definition. Perhaps St. Pius did not intend to define anything in Pascendi, but it's very close. There's a distinction to be made between the Jansenist denial that their errors are to be found in the book Augustinus, and the modernists' denial that their errors and their system are to be found described accurately in Pascendi. Then the only distinction is one of the degree of the offense. That they're doing the same thing in essence. That denying that this characterization and condemnation of error got the error right and found it in the right spot, correctly identified where it is to be found. So the modernists declared that they could not find themselves in the incriminated system. Pascendi was talking about someone else, they said, possibly some imaginary theologian. So imagine St. Pius X had a fever dream about modernism and decided next day to write an encyclical about it. And also keep in mind that the Pope does not ordinarily write an encyclical and put it out just by himself without any further consultation. These are, in fact, when you read an encyclical, clearly these are thoroughly researched and meticulously written documents. Many of them, certainly. Others might be shorter, and may not be quite so expansive. But some encyclicals are very lengthy and develop a great deal of doctrine, are clearly very well researched, have many citations. That's not to be dismissed just on the lowest possible level. That is something that cannot be dismissed easily any more than you would dismiss a well-researched and thoroughly documented paper by any learned man in his field on any subject. That would be very rash. You would just to dismiss the work of an expert geologist or something, saying he doesn't know what he's talking about, he just got that wrong, would be very, very rash for other people in that same field to do. Right? The same applies on just that level, abstracting from every other consideration, which other considerations definitely do apply. But just on that level, it's extremely rash of the modernists to say that, if nothing else. But of course, here we're talking about as well about, in fact, papal teaching, which is another aspect, a whole nother level. Like that brings it up to a whole nother level, which means that these are teachings in which we must assent. And also keep in mind that when you have a condemnation, say an anathema, the opposite, that which the truth of the faith, for the purpose of defending which that anathema was put out, requires the very highest degree of assent. In other words, if an error has received a solemn condemnation, then the truth to which it is contrary must be believed as a defined dogma of faith. So if something is condemned, there's a whole list of theological censures. You see all that also in your De Ecclesia course. Some of you may have, as I understand, have seen that course, which was given from the past few years. But there is a whole long list of condemnations. It's a fairly common misconception that there are two possibilities concerning any given theological proposition, that it's either a heresy or a defined dogma of faith. And the fact of the matter is that there's a whole range in between. That yes, there are definitely many heresies that have been condemned in the history of the church, and many dogmas that have been defined, absolutely. But there are also dogmas which have not been defined. That is to say, teachings which belong to divine revelation, either explicitly or implicitly, which are proposed by the universal ordinary magisterium, but have never been defined, really because there is no motive to define it. Remember that also, that definitions are typically only put down when there's some motive for it. And the motive, more often than not, is almost always, and if you look at the history of condemnations and definitions, it's because somebody saying a heresy. That needs to be condemned. We need to clear things up here. Good opportunity to clear things up. It's not say that only under those circumstances can or may the church issue a definition, but that's usually the motive. Usually. And, for example, the Vatican Council, the Vatican I, the actual one, defined that it is not only possible, but in fact easy for natural reason to prove that God exists. So why was there never a definition of that till the 19th century? Well, maybe nobody ever was stupid enough to deny that before. We need to have something so basic as that clarified. That means things are bad. That means things have gone very badly downhill, have gone very badly awry. There's a very great deal of disbelief. But that was indeed defined. It's abundantly obvious, was abundantly obvious long before that. But the point is that by 1870, there was motive to define that. Now, there are other motives to define things as well. I'm not aware, for example, that there was any widespread denial of the dogma of the Assumption, of Our Lady's Assumption to heaven, when Pius XII defined that in 1950. It seems that was a definition done for really devotional reasons, which is excellent. I mean, that was an excellent thing that Pius XII defined Our Lady's Assumption into heaven. But as far as I know, that was not due to any anti-Assumption heresies that may or may not have ever risen in the history of the church. There are various different heresies that you can point out clearly and identify clearly throughout the history of the church, but I'm not aware of anybody besides, Hans Kung denied the Assumption of Our Lady, He said the assumption is just an assumption with a lowercase a. In other words, the idea that Our Lady was assumed to heaven, somebody just assumed that was the case, and just dismissing it as that. That's that man's level of impiety. And remember, at Vatican II, there was the evil triumvirate of Ratzinger, Rahner, and Kung. So they were the absolute far left radicals engineering Vatican II, and which of course makes it all the more amusing in a way. And in a way, it's just absolutely dismaying. But in another way, it's somewhat amusing that Ratzinger later on, in decades later in the future, came to be known as the arch-conservative, as the watchdog of orthodoxy. You can't even say that without, while keeping a straight face. Ratzinger, the watchdog of orthodoxy. He was wearing a suit and tie at Vatican II in the early '60s. Everybody was, even all of the clergy of the Catholic Church were still wearing proper clerical attire at the time, and he was there in suit and tie. Ratzinger himself. So it's the idea that he was some kind of conservative is an absolute joke. But Red Sox, don't forget the Red Sox. That fixes everything. Good thing they had used the right dye, because that wouldn't have fixed anything. So modernism, one of which, of course, Ratzinger himself is or was. After the publication of Pascendi, they said, "Oh, that's not us. Where we don't say those things." Pascendi was talking about somebody else, possibly some imaginary theologian, apparently from some fever dream of St. Pius X. Nous ne sommes pas même effleurés. That probably should be, I think it's missing some accent marks there. I'll have to look into that. But anyways, that's what Maurice Blondel said. That we're not hit by this at all. We're not affected by this. That this was, these shots are intended for somebody else. We don't say these things. St. Pius X stated unequivocally in Pascendi, anyone who is found to be tainted with modernism is to be excluded without compunction from those offices, whether of government or of teaching, and those who already occupy them are to be removed. The same policy is to be adopted towards those who openly or secretly lend countenance to modernism, either by extolling the modernists or excusing their culpable conduct, or by carping at scholasticism, or the magisterium of the Church, or by refusing obedience to ecclesiastical authority or any of its depositories, and towards those who show a love of novelty in history, archaeology, or biblical exegesis. And finally, towards those who neglect the sacred sciences or appear to prefer the secular sciences to them. So just a little bit of explanation of this. These are passages of Pascendi which I do not recall that we actually covered last year. So we covered some of it, but that's actually an example of a very long, very thorough encyclical, very damning of modernism, just destroys it completely. And we did not have time to go through every word of it, but this definitely is worth touching upon here, given that the author of Roncalli's biography himself brings it up. So, you see, for one thing, in that first paragraph, at least the final full paragraph on page 1 of this section of the notes, that anyone who is to be found tainted with modernism is to be excluded without compunction from all of those offices that he lists there. Just exclude them completely. Get them out. Don't let them in, and if they're in, get them out. And the same policy is to be adopted towards the modernizers, in essence, here. In other words, those who may not be openly modernists themselves, but who push modernism in one way or another. Perhaps more or less subtly, more or less cleverly, more cleverly than perhaps the open modernists themselves, but who nonetheless push it. Yeah, the modernizers, among whom we can easily put Cardinal Ferrari. So those who lend countenance to modernism, or extol modernism, or excuse their or those who secretly lend countenance to it by extolling modernism or modernists, or their culpable conduct, or by carping at scholasticism. Remember, St. Pius X also said that a sure sign of modernism is hatred of Thomism. Remember the reason for that, because St. Thomas is in fact crystal clear. That's not to say easy. Some things St. Thomas talks about are in fact easy to comprehend. For example, most of his 5 proofs of the existence of God are fairly easy to follow. Talking about the first mover or the first cause, that's pretty easy. Some of the other proofs are a little bit more involved in that, but just because St. Thomas is crystal clear doesn't mean that he's always easy. Sometimes you really have to work to get at what he's saying. But once you get to it, you realize that this is thought out perfectly and is in fact crystal clear. Once you've worked it out, you realize that it doesn't get any better than this. We'll just put it that way. It doesn't get any better than this as far as expounding upon the truths of the faith. That, of course, subsequent popes drew heavily themselves from St. Thomas in explaining the faith, that this is even made Thomism mandatory. So it really has the intellectual gifts of St. Thomas have been recognized by the Church ever since his own lifetime. He called hatred of Thomism a sure sign of a modernist, because a modernist hate clarity for a variety of reasons, but one of which is that clarity makes it easy to detect aberration. When you have a very set, standardized way of talking about these things, a set vocabulary, a vocabulary of very technical terms which have precisely defined meanings, and a well-defined system within which they work, and within which those terms are used to create to form different premises according to which you reason. That's all very clear. If you err in any way, that will easily be discovered, easily be found out. So the modernists, realizing that, see this and think there's no way we can use this to get through the ideas that we want to get through. If we try to use it, this system, we'll be found out immediately. So so for them, it's an evil. Clarity is an evil. And that's just one of the reasons. They also have this idea of a constant need for mystery and a striving towards something. And that all takes place in this hazy cloud of mystery. They have that idea too. So for them, for a number of reasons, clarity is an evil thing. And so, of course, in itself, it's not an evil, but that's how they perceive it. They perceive it as an evil. And an evil is something that is deserving of punishment, and in that sense is the object of hatred. And so these modernists, seeing Thomism, seeing the system of St. Thomas as an evil to them, they hate it. Whereas if anybody who actually has the virtue of faith realizes that this is excellent for preserving and explaining the truths of the faith. And that's a good thing. That people should clearly have a clear grasp, a clear understanding and a firm grasp on divine revelation. That's a good thing. But if you don't have the virtue of faith, because you're a modernist, that's a bad thing. So, carping at scholasticism is somebody who is clearly either a modernist or of modernist tendency, or at the magisterium of the church. So that's another thing. Of course, the modernists have nothing but contempt for the magisterium of the church, because they look at scholasticism, which of course has been, or neo-scholasticism as they call it, of which the magisterium of the church makes great use, as being a fortress. And they say this in a contemptuous way. That's a fortress around divine revelation, hemming it in and keeping it contained or something like that. That's a good thing. Again, that's another argument in favor of it. That is precisely why the church has adopted scholasticism and scholastic terminology in expounding the truths of the faith. Precisely because it defends divine revelation so well. It does not let modernists, does not let heretics in general, modernists especially, who attack, of course, every single truth of the faith, ultimately. But it doesn't allow it. It's true. It does not allow the enemy into the castle. It does not, because remember, heretics, in some sense, they steal certain truths of the faith and work them into their erroneous systems. And it's actually because of those elements of truth, in a sense, that people are attracted to heretical systems. Nobody ever is attracted to error as error, obviously. People are only attracted to erroneous systems because of some element of truth that it has, or at least something about it that's attractive to them. And that there should be some truths to something somebody says is something attractive. And so if you can get that attractive aspect along with combining that with other motives for adopting some erroneous system, usually, many times it's some very low motive, the motive of concupiscence, but not necessarily, though many times that clearly turns out to be the case. When you have that, those elements that combine, those things that make an erroneous system attractive, then you get people to accept them. Yeah, nobody ever accepted error as error. The will is created for good. Always remember that the human will is created for good. And in fact, at the very dawn of reason, the dawn of the use of reason, God himself moves the will, and he moves it towards the good. So nobody can ever choose evil as evil, only the aspect of being good. So the people who refuse who dislike, therefore, the protection, in a sense, that the system of St. Thomas affords divine revelation, have a tendency to hate it and to trample on it to whatever extent they can, belittling it as something evil. So they modernists also, of course, are modernizers. Anybody who is sympathetic with the modernists also refuses obedience to ecclesiastical authority or its depositories. Say anybody who has authority from the church. Towards those who show a love of novelty in history, archaeology, or biblical exegesis. And we'll see the reasons for those things, but biblical exegesis simply means interpretations, different schools of thought as to the meaning of sacred scripture. And finally, towards those who neglect the sacred sciences or appear to prefer the secular sciences to them. And Umberto Benigni, whom we've talked about before, was encouraged by Cardinal Mary Doval to create a secret network of informers, the Sodalitium Pianum, and apostolic visitations, which Ferrari called apostolic vexations, which we've also seen, began in suspect dioceses. So there were some places that were clearly, where there was a clearly suspicious activity going on, or where clearly modernistic ideas were being floated, or being circulated, and those were places to which St. Pius X sent these apostolic visitations. The Milanese Review Il Rinnovamento was condemned. So St. Pius X, in fact, condemned it. Just to give you an idea of, the measures taken by St. Pius X. Remember that the day after the publication of Pascendi, there was a response written to it. And that book, which was written in response to it, was put on the index and its publishers excommunicated. There was no messing around, as they say. On December 7th of 1907, Don Roncalli gave a lecture at the Bergamo Seminary to commemorate the third centenary of the death of Baronius, his appointed theme being faith and scientific research. So Baronius was, in fact, a cardinal who wrote a tremendous work on church history. And actually, we have it in the library here. It's in the reference section. But we do, in fact, have the work of Cardinal Baronius on church history. And Cardinal Baronius was, in fact, you may know, a disciple, we can say, of St. Philip Neri, who was himself something of the apostle of, apostle of Rome, in the sense that he wanted to be a missionary. In that sense, he wanted to carry out a missionary apostolate, but he ended up actually just working in Rome. So far from working in the outer edges of the areas in which the church had evangelized up to that point, St. Philip Neri ended up working in Rome itself, in that sense, at the very heart of the church. But indeed, it can be surprising sometimes. When you study the history of the church, how bad things can get in Rome itself. Remember that in the early to mid 19th century, that there were popes whose, I believe it was Leo XII. I'd have to check up on that, but as I recall, it was Pope Leo XII whose pontificate was devoted mainly to just cleaning up the city of Rome itself in various different ways. And that was the main focus of his reign. And he, in fact, even establishing a congregation of the Visitation just to go around to the different churches in Rome to make sure that they were in suitable condition, to make sure that they were clean, for one thing. That was a big issue, was making sure the churches were clean. So Cardinal Baronius was a disciple, might say, of St. Philip Neri, whose efforts were focused mainly in Rome, and who really, Cardinal Baronius really wrote his church history out of obedience to St. Philip Neri. He didn't want to do that. When you study we had a number of years ago, we had the biography of St. Philip Neri read at table, and that was one thing that was clear, that St. Philip Neri had to require Baronius, who was not a cardinal at the time, but he had to require him to do that, to take on that huge project of writing the history of the church, of course, up to that time, to the 16th century. So naturally, it only goes up to a certain point, but the work that Cardinal Baronius did is in fact of immense value. And even after Baronius became a cardinal, he became a cardinal during the lifetime of St. Philip Neri, who himself never became a bishop or anything. He was always, in that sense, a simple priest, even if he was had the reputation of being a saint during his own lifetime. He never received episcopal consecration or the cardinal's hat or anything. And also, I suppose, keep in mind that it is possible to be a cardinal without becoming a bishop. But he never became a cardinal or anything. Cardinal Baronius did, and as in the biography of St. Philip Neri, you can read about the fact that St. Philip Neri at one point had to move from one place to another, and he had to leave his cat behind. He had a cat, apparently. He had to leave his cat behind, and to keep Cardinal Baronius humble, he would send Cardinal Baronius, as a cardinal, to go and check up on the cat, wherever the place the cat where the cat was still living. So St. Philip Neri was famous for that, being able to keep people humble. In fact, he would give out this in instances of things that only saints can get away with. He would give people all kinds of odd things to do as penances for absolution. The kinds of things all the moral theologians would say, don't ever impose those as penances, because that would make the sacrament hateful to people. So getting a haircut but only half your head or something like that. Those are the kinds of things that St. Philip Neri would impose as a penance. All the moral theologians would say, never ever do that. Don't ever impose that as a penance. That will turn people away from the confessional. But St. Philip Neri could do that. He could inspire such fervor in people that was not an issue. But you have to be a saint to be able to do that. You have to have the reputation of St. Philip Neri while he was still alive to be able to do that. So this is 3 centuries after the death of Cardinal Baronius. Roncalli gives a lecture at the Bergamo Seminary, his appointed theme being faith and scientific research. And this is Roncalli's biographer. Although Baronius, remember, the biographer who is favorable to John the 23rd. Although Baronius was the pretext, his real subject was the place of historical scholarship in the church in the year 1907, just 4 months after Pascendi. So clearly this is, if Roncalli's in favor, so to speak, biographer admits it, then that this is, you see the reason then why we, in fact, read the works of people like this, because they don't hide anything. If this were a traditional Catholic priest after Vatican II writing that Roncalli gave this, just had Baronius as his pretext, you might be inclined to dismiss that, or at least take it with a grain of salt that here's somebody who's somewhat partisan saying this. But you have here somebody who can be characterized as partisan, but for the other party. Somebody who's very much in favor of Vatican II and the man who started it. Because remember, that is why we're looking at Roncalli in such detail here, as somebody set up by Pius XII, who started Vatican II. We're looking at all the ways in which the reign of Pius XII was, in a sense, the threshold of Vatican II. Remember, of course, Paul VI is looked upon as the real villain of Vatican II, at least the one who is the first to be a real villain. And he certainly was, and is certainly he was personally villainous, and villainous very extremely so in his capacity as false Pope Paul VI. But remember that if it was Paul VI who, in a sense, unfurled all of the sails of the ship of Vatican II. It was Roncalli who set it on its course and took it out of the harbor to begin with. And after he died, it was just everything continued along the same course, the course that he clearly had in mind. So here we're looking at the deviousness of Roncalli. So using Baronius as a pretext, he defended historical criticism and spoke of the wonderful progress that has been made in scientific history in the last few years. Clearly in favor of modernism. And historical criticism does not mean that's to be taken in the worst possible sense. That is to say, explaining everything away, especially anything supernatural, by means of saying, this is a story that was good for the time, inspired by the time, a product of its time. That's historical criticism. It's explaining everything away by means of quote-unquote historical context. So he claimed that Baronius has quite rightly been hailed as the founder of historical criticism. No doubt that Baronius was, in a good sense, very critical when he did his research and putting together his church history, his work on church history. But critical in a good sense means looking past perhaps a skewed presentation of the facts and getting to what is actually the case. I mean, there is a good way, of course. It is possible to read critically in a good sense. But in the sense that the modernists use, historical criticism is the worst possible. In such a way that you can deny the faith and have a pretext for doing it. So Baronius was definitely not a modernist, whatever he was. Centuries before the invention of modernism to begin with. But he was definitely not in terms of historical criticism. That's really all just nonsense. So he, that is Roncalli, was asserting that the church had been the first in the field of historical criticism. So this is the whole idea of modernism, trying to make the church acceptable to the modern world. That was the idea of Vatican II. Remember, aggiornamento, updating. That's one of the ways to translate that. Updating. Keeping the church up to par with everything. Keeping up with the Joneses, as the saying goes. That's the idea. So you see Roncalli already engaging in that as a young priest in a time of all this modernistic historical criticism, which remember is heavily inspired itself by liberal Protestantism, saying, well, the church was there first. All of this is in vogue. We were there first, actually. Not only are we okay with this, we were there first. Historical criticism. See, it started with Cardinal Baronius centuries ago, which is nonsense. The church has always been in favor, of course, of accurately presenting the facts in order to prove exactly the opposite of what all of those liberal Protestants and modernists all claim to discover by means of historical criticism. In fact, if you look at it, if you actually you've studied that in De Revelatione, that all of the detail, just one of the arguments to prove the authenticity of sacred scripture, and the Gospels in particular, at the depth of the details given in the Gospels is just by itself an indication, really, one of the proofs that this could not possibly be made up. And when somebody gives you someone who's testifying to some event gives you the exact time of day, the place, who did what, where, when, and how, then you're very much inclined to believe that person when he's very specific. As a general rule. Somebody who is, for one thing, credible to begin with, has to have motives of credibility. Somebody who knows what he's talking about and doesn't lie. But when somebody has those credentials and then gives a very detailed narration of some event, you're very much inclined to believe that this person not only saw this happen, but took very careful note of everything that happened during that event. So the church has obviously always been very much in favor of getting the facts right. In fact, that always works in favor of the church, because there's so many accusations against the church, where all on this or that occasion the church did this or did that, sold indulgences, for example. Again, looking at what was actually the case disproves that. And that shows that there was perhaps abuses at the time, but that the church was not engaging in any kind of intrinsically evil activity at the time.